Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating analysis that looks at how the demographic claims of the Book of Mormon actually align with the principles of population genetics. We're going to explore this awesome intersection of ancient texts, historical demographics, and modern biology. And specifically, we're going to focus on why genetic dilution isn't just a convenient excuse, but is entirely consistent with the narrative itself.
Okay, let's tackle the elephant in the room right off the bat. The source confronts the most famous biological objection out there, the apparent lack of Middle Eastern DNA in modern Native American populations. Look, if you follow this topic, you have almost certainly heard this argument, because the primary ancestral signals in the Americas are Beringian or Asian. Critics look at the genetic data and basically say, well, the narrative simply cannot be historical. They ask the ultimate question: if these people migrated from Jerusalem, where is the genetic proof?
To unpack this mystery, we're going to hit 6 quick areas today: the genetic objection, demographics demand intermixing, the science of admixture, the Latin American parallel, silences that speak volumes, and finally, a coherent framework. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The genetic objection. So the source points out something really critical here. The entire genetic objection rests heavily on what's called the pure descent assumption. Basically, this is the belief that the Book of Mormon peoples were this closed, isolated, exclusively Israelite population, descending solely from a few original founders. But here's the kicker. The text's actual reality describes small founding groups being absorbed into much larger indigenous populations. When researchers actually take the text's own demographic statement seriously, that pure descent assumption just completely collapses.
Moving right along to Section 2, demographics demand intermixing.
The researchers note that the text repeatedly describes massive, incredibly lopsided population disparities, and it does this very early on in the timeline. Take a look at this quote from Jerem 1:6. It plainly states that the Lamanites were exceedingly more numerous than the Nephites. Now, what makes this so compelling is that the text also acknowledges the Nephites had a distinct agricultural advantage, and yet the Lamanite populations were vastly outnumbering them. Sure, you can have different birth rates, but the sheer scale of the difference between these two groups really starts to hint at a much larger demographic reality playing out. Because honestly, the math of natural human reproduction just doesn't allow for it. The text later describes military forces and total populations on a massive scale. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. Even if you use the most ridiculously generous assumptions about huge family sizes and zero mortality rates, you literally cannot generate hundreds of thousands of people from a handful of reproductive age adults arriving around 600 BC. It's biologically impossible. So the researchers argue this strictly demands the conclusion that they intermixed with existing populations, differentially absorbing much larger surrounding groups. Furthermore, the source explicitly reveals that people took on these names based on allegiance, or a compound of descent and descent. This perfectly mirrors ancient patterns of ethnogenesis. That's just a fancy word for the formation of a new group identity. When a Nephite descended, guess what? They became a Lamanite. Identity wasn't about swabbing your cheek for exact DNA, it was about political and cultural alignment. In the ancient world, it was incredibly common for a smaller founding elite group to lend its name, its religion, or its political structure to a much larger surrounding population.
Let's look at Section 3, the science of admixture.
Okay, so when a small immigrant group enters a much larger host population, their autosomal DNA undergoes rapid dilution. Autosomal DNA is the genetic material you inherit from both your mom and your dad. Because it recombines in every single generation, a small founding contribution doesn't just sit there intact forever, it blends. Think of it like putting a single drop of blue food coloring into a massive Olympic-sized swimming pool. Over successive generations of admixture with that larger host population, that initial genetic signature is diluted down toward a vanishingly small, nearly undetectable fraction. And this source argues that this rapid dilution is exactly why the complete disappearance of a rare Middle Eastern genetic signature is actually scientifically expected. It's entirely consistent with the narrative. As we just saw, autosomal DNA blends and dilutes rapidly. But you might be wondering, what about uniparental markers, like the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA? Well, these are passed intact without blending. But instead of diluting, a founder haplogroup persists in ever fewer descendants until processes like genetic drift and population bottlenecks extinguish it entirely. A rare lineage introduced by just a handful of founders can easily be wiped out completely within a relatively short number of generations.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Latin American parallel.
To really bring this home, despite the massive influx of European colonists over the last 5 centuries, modern mestizo populations in many regions of Latin America frequently retain indigenous genetic majorities. I mean, think about the sheer scale of European colonization. Massive,
massive numbers of settlers arriving over hundreds of years. And yet, genetic studies in regions like Mexico, Central America, and the Andes show that indigenous American ancestry often equals or entirely exceeds European ancestry, particularly in overall autosomal DNA.
This is absolutely crucial to understand. The authors use this modern parallel to explain why genetic dilution is so consistent with the narrative. Think about it. If massive European colonization couldn't erase indigenous signals in 500 years, they argue it is totally scientifically expected that a tiny founding group over 2,000 years would leave zero clear genetic signal. The European colonization involved vastly larger numbers and happened way more recently. If that massive demographic input still leaves an indigenous majority today, a far, far smaller founding group over a much longer time depth would naturally be completely, utterly absorbed genetically.
Let's transition to Section 5, Silences that Speak Volumes.
So let's play devil's advocate for a second. If we actually entertain the critics' assumption that they were a closed, pure descent population for centuries, we have to ask what the biological consequences would actually be. The researchers ask us to imagine this. What would literally happen to a tiny group of people intermarrying exclusively among themselves for hundreds and hundreds of years?
Well, it wouldn't be pretty. A strictly isolated group of that size would inevitably suffer from catastrophic, unavoidable genetic realities. The source points out you would see severe founder effects, where rare, often harmful genetic traits become heavily magnified. You'd see rapid inbreeding depression, which means a drastic loss of biological fitness. Recessive genetic disorders would surface at highly elevated rates. The group's overall genetic diversity would just collapse, leaving them incredibly vulnerable to disease and causing significantly reduced fertility. Whenever we look at historical examples of small, isolated founder populations, they always demonstrate milder versions of these exact effects.
And here is the fascinating part. The source argues that the absolute absence of any mention of congenital disease or chronic infertility in the text serves as heavy, indirect evidence that they were not an isolated founder population. The narrative nowhere describes the kind of genetic fragility that extreme isolation guarantees. A closed population would produce highly conspicuous, hard-to-miss physical effects. The fact that the authors don't mention these issues is a powerful confirmation that the whole closed population assumption is fundamentally flawed from the start.
Finally, Section 6, a coherent framework. Now, historians point out that while some folks see the lack of surrounding indigenous chronicles corroborating these events as a major problem, this asymmetry in written records is actually the perfectly normal state of evidence in pre-Columbian societies. A small literate covenant group is going to produce a written record, but the larger surrounding populations they absorbed into, outside of a few limited zones, they relied primarily on oral traditions, material culture, and linguistic traces. Oral cultures just do not leave archival chronicles. So the absence of independent indigenous written records naming specific peoples isn't some unique, fatal problem, it's just the ordinary consequence of uneven ancient literacy.
Ultimately, the source concludes that when you finally drop the closed population assumption, the demographic framework actually aligns perfectly. The demographic statements of the text, the known principles of population genetics, and the historical realities of the Americas all fit together like a glove. The rapid genetic dilution we've been discussing today is exactly why they argue the lack of a Middle Eastern genetic signal is a consistent, expected feature of the narrative, rather than a flaw.
I want to leave you with this final thought. While this explainer doesn't definitively prove historicity, the source presents an incredibly compelling challenge to the standard genetic objections. If the most frequently cited external criticisms rest entirely on assumptions that the text itself actively contradicts, it really forces us to ask, what else might we be misreading? Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this source.